And Fox. Thanks very much. I am the Chief Exec of Clinks. I am also a member of the Women's Justice Board. So I'm here with both hats on, but no hat because it's far too hot. And it's a brilliant opportunity this morning. We're really grateful to David Gauke and to officials who are here to help us understand. Oh, Kelly, I'm in Coventry as well. There you go. To help us understand what the independent sentencing review recommendations and the implementation plan going forward means when it comes to women. So there's quite a good context for it all. Obviously, in our sector, you know, that there's a great number of people here today. We're expecting up to 75 people. We're currently on 68. So there's real interest and passion in this area, and people really want to get going. So this is really the first opportunity we've had to have real in-depth look at what do the recommendations say and what is the opportunities, and to explore some of those together. And we'll have that ongoing as we move forward in the implementation phases that hopefully we'll hear about soon. But I wanted to set a bit, I suppose, of the backdrop. So the first one being, we have had a lack of real progress in relation to women over the last number of years. We had the seminal Baroness Corsten seminal review and the establishment of the Corsten Independent Funders Coalition. And I know some of the funders, including Beth, who works for the coalition, are here today. But we had a lack of progress. And we had some things that were recommended, not least by David as Lord Chancellor, that would have been beneficial for women. And we had a female offender strategy, but we had a lack of progress in implementation. So we shoot forward to the establishment of the current government, and the Lord Chancellor has established a Women's Justice Board, of which I am one member. And at pretty much the same time, commissioned this review. So we did meet with David and his team during the review, and we have, I think, a specific opportunity in that we have the board and we have what's available to the board in terms of our connections across HMPPS, MOJ and wider agencies, our connections into delivery and into the voluntary sector and academia. And we will be coming forward with a strategic document in the coming months. And we've been coming to the Women's Network, and we will continue to do that, to talk about that, this being a special meeting of that Women's Network facilitated by Clinks and Agenda Alliance. So just a quick bit on the Women's Justice Board for anyone who's kind of not as au fait. The Women's Justice Board, and I think this is why I want you to kind of have that context, because I think a lot of it will come to life when you think about how do we make the sentencing review happen in relation to women. So the purpose of the board is to reduce the number of women in prison and increase the number supported in the community. It will provide the vision and direction on how to reform women's justice to address the distinct needs of women in or at risk of contact with the criminal justice system. Primary initial focus is on work to intervene earlier and divert women away from the criminal justice system where appropriate. Community solutions to increase the use of robust community sentences and support resettlement from custody, including engagement with sentencers to promote increasing the use of community options where appropriate, and consideration of approaches such as intensive supervision and problem-solving courts, and development of alternative models to custody and the role of women's community services. Addressing issues specific to pregnant women and mothers with dependent children in the criminal justice system, including those in prison, and reducing the number of young adult women entering the CJS and improving outcomes for them across the CJS. Work on each of the board's priority areas considers the needs of all women, including any issues arising from their circumstances, as well as the particular needs of women who both offend and are victims of sexual abuse or domestic abuse or violence. So that's the Women's Justice Board. And I think the context being useful, that there's a delivery structure now to take some of the things in the sentencing review that align quite nicely, particularly around those community options. And the publication of the sentencing review has been really welcome from a women's justice perspective. in terms of what the majority of women are sentenced to prison in a background of trauma, disadvantage, the overwhelming number who are victims of coercive control, victims of domestic abuse and violence, and women who have experienced great deals of trauma throughout their life, but not great service experiences, and are criminalized a lot of the time for their behavior. So in the sentencing review, there are specific things. I don't want to steal David's thunder, but I want to just remark on stuff that we really welcome. The first thing I wanted to say to you as a sector is we see your fingerprints all over that review. The work that you have done, the evidence that you've gathered, the models that you've been involved in over many years. We heard your voices, and I'm massively thankful to David and his team, his brilliant panel, who really did engage with the sector, with the evidence, and you all took the opportunity that was given to you with great gusto. Some of the particular high points that we'd like to dive into today are the presumption against short custodial sentences of less than 12 months, which we know will have a massive impact on the number of women going to prison. The rollout of further liaison and diversion pathways, the rollout of further intensive supervision or problem-solving courts and approaches, the sustainable funding for women's centres. Feel free to cheer or hit your little reaction buttons at any stage, folks. Like I said, your fingerprints are all over it. And also in relation to women in prison, I suppose there are less, I suppose, areas for celebration there, but hopefully the reduction will be so significant if this all works. And I suppose it's not an if, we have to all help make it work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the chair of the Independent Sentencing Review, David Gauke. David is going to talk to you for a bit. I'm hoping it's about the sentencing review, but you never know, it could be a book review from what's behind him. And then what we'll do is we'll have loads of time for discussion and questions. So I'd ask you, when we do that, we'll take them in 3s or 4s so that we get more of a discussion going with David and the group. And we will do our best to give everyone a chance. David, over to you.
And thank you very much for that kind introduction. And can I thank everyone for joining us today? So, really good numbers, which I'm delighted to see. And also, just to add to what Anne was saying, thank everyone for the engagement with the sentencing review over the 6 months or so we were running. I think it is pretty clear that that engagement did prove to be very influential. Certainly as a panel, we spent a lot of time in terms of visiting facilities that were specifically for women and engaging with this sector. I do think that influence is clear, and within the review, the importance of dealing with women in custody and trying to reduce that number is pretty it's pretty strong. I see a message that I'm quiet. People struggling to hear me.
Speak up and out if you can. Yeah, it's a little bit quiet.
I think I should be speaking up, and I don't normally.
That got a bit louder for me.
I've got a little bit louder, and I've brought it a little bit closer, so hopefully that has done the trick. But let me know if you can't hear me. But yeah, so yeah, as I say, just to reiterate, many thanks to the sector for your engagement with us, responding to the call for evidence, and so on. And I very much hope that you feel that you have been listened to. If I can just sort of briefly say a word or two about the context in which we were operating and what we were trying to do. And there's no getting away from the, if you like, the argument of necessity about our prisons essentially being full, projected to be not only full, but for demand to exceed supply very significantly within 2 or 3 years. And we set ourselves an objective to reduce the prison population. Well, I say we set ourselves, we were essentially given the objective of reducing the prison population to 9,500 below what it is projected to be by early 2028. And if you look at our, if you like, our big measures that are designed to meet that numerical target, it wasn't as if we sort of said, right, here are some measures for men and here are some measures for women. But I do think that if you look at what we have set out, this is likely to have a proportionately bigger impact in terms of the female population. And as Anne has already touched upon, the argument that we would only, or the proposal that we would only put someone would receive a custodial sentence of 12 months or less in exceptional circumstances is likely to have a disproportionate effect on women. 78% of women who are sentenced to custody get a sentence of 12 months or less. That compares to 61% for men. So that is likely to have quite a big impact. It's also worth noting that the second of our 5 measures designed to reduce the custodial population, which is the more flexible use of suspended sentence orders, so that the maximum period is now 3 years, not 2 years. That is also likely to have a reasonably significant impact in terms of the female population, and could certainly be used in the context of pregnant women or mothers of very young children. We could imagine that would be used more widely there. A similar point could be made in terms of deferred sentences. We haven't got a numerical, we didn't have the robust evidence to put a numerical value on the savings that will be delivered by that. But greater use of deferred sentences we can absolutely see being used very widely in the context of pregnant women or mothers. So we think that is also likely to play an important part. Looking more sort of specifically at what we're trying to do in terms of women, and you'll be aware that there is a whole section in chapter 6 which is about female offenders and trying to find ways to address them, to reduce reoffending, but also to reduce the use of custody. There are a whole set of measures that we set out there in that context. As Anne has already mentioned, greater use of women's centres and ensuring that there's sustainable long-term funding for women's centres, we think is really important. We do see the evidence of the way in which women's centres can enable women who've been diverted into the community to receive the sort of support that they need, that is much more likely to be effective and address the root causes of their offending. And look, this is part of a sort of wider recognition that very often female offenders are driven by trauma, are driven by being the victims of crime themselves. And this is one effective way of responding to it. I'd also add the proper use of health and social care support throughout this, the expansion of the use of liaison and diversion services, considering a women's specific pathway as part of drug and alcohol treatment requirements. All of that, I think, is going to be important. One area where I think we have gone backwards in recent years, and you touched on the sense that maybe progress hasn't been made, and the women prison population has been rising. One issue here that I don't think we can ignore is the use of, or has been the greater use of assault on emergency workers legislation. And I was in Parliament when this was initially brought in, and then the maximum sentence was increased, and subsequently been increased again. And there is talk of bringing in further uses of specific assault on shop workers, for example. I think we have to be aware that assault on emergency workers has contributed to more women going to prison. I think that was not a consequence that I certainly remember being flagged up when this legislation was initially passed. And I think there is a need to review that. That was an unintended consequence. And I think that has had a detrimental effect on this. And I think it would be right for the MOJ to look at it in greater detail. I also want to sort of particularly highlight the role of intensive supervision courts. I spent a fascinating day in Birmingham seeing the ISC there, which specifically focuses on female offenders, and was struck by the kind of turnaround that one would see. The morning was spent watching if you like, the formal court processes where various female offenders would more often than not agree to go on the intensive supervision route, go down the intensive supervision route. And then I spent the afternoon watching the judge then meet those who were going through that route. And the progress that was being made was really startling. Sense that people's lives were being turned around. And look, I am conscious in the context of our proposals on short sentences that you will get people saying, but what do you do about the prolific offenders? What do you do about the people who commit offence after offence after offence, don't get a custodial sentence, but then keep on reoffending, and eventually society loses patience and demands a respite? And that's not an unreasonable reaction. But we do know from the evidence that a short custodial sentence isn't helpful. But what, in terms of reducing reoffending, but what might be helpful, what might be useful in terms of turning these people's lives around and protecting society from future reoffending? And I think there is emerging evidence that these intensive supervision courts can play an important role. They won't work for everybody, but they do work for substantial numbers. There's good international evidence to support this. And the emerging evidence from where intensive supervision courts are used in the UK, if they're directed at the right type of offenders, that can be quite significant. So I am a great believer that these ISCs can play an important role, and one of our recommendations is that this is rolled out and that there is greater use of this. So I think that is also going to be an important factor. A few other points just to sort of touch on briefly, so I want to leave plenty of time for questions. The training and education of the judiciary is for the independent judiciary, but we do recommend that the judiciary keep training under review to ensure that it's properly informed about the particular issues that tend to apply to female offenders, and that there's a proper understanding of the needs and vulnerabilities of those offenders. So we make reference to that. Also note that the move away from prison as a place of safety in the recent mental health bill, we need to make sure that that is properly implemented. And just a word or so on pre-sentence reports. The review supports measures to improve PSRs, particularly for female offenders on the cusp of custody. And this was a point that was highlighted in the call for evidence about ensuring that issues of domestic abuse, etc., are properly taken into account. I should also mention, in terms of statutory defences for victims of domestic abuse, that was outside our remit as such, but we certainly encourage the government to consider whether the availability of a statutory defence, such as self-defence, may prevent victims of domestic abuse from being unnecessarily criminalised. So we make reference to that. But really, just to conclude my comments at this point, is to say, look, I do think that there is a big opportunity here. The government has accepted the majority of recommendations that we have set out. My understanding is that we will hear something about legislation in the not too distant future. And there is an opportunity to shape legislation in a way that I think is going to be much more effective in terms of reducing reoffending, and should result in fewer women being sent to custody, being sent to prison. I have to say, and maybe I would say this, I think what would be helpful as much as possible is if the recommendations that we have set out in the independent sentencing review are accepted as a whole. The more that sort of individual sort of strings are pulled at it, and there are sort of arguments of, well, we quite like this, but we don't like that, the more the whole agenda can be placed under perhaps a greater degree of sort of scrutiny and criticism and so on. So I very much hope that the government essentially, it's not accepted every one of our recommendations, but accepts these recommendations overwhelmingly and legislates for them accordingly, and that Parliament won't come forward, backbenchers and I don't know about opposition parties, but certainly government backbenchers don't come forward with lots of amendments that try to that are well-meaning, but could make the package perhaps less coherent. And so that's the important stage. So I very much hope that doesn't happen. But I'm pleased with, by and large, how this has landed. And I think this really does create a great opportunity. So I think the more that, for example, this sector can sort of fall in behind the recommendation, support that agenda, I think the greater the opportunity we have to implement something that could be really important, really significant, and ensure that, if we have lost a bit of momentum on this agenda, as Anne suggests, in recent years, that can not only be restored, but we can go further than we were previously. So I hope this is an exciting time. This is a time of opportunity, driven by necessity, but nonetheless a real sense that here is an opportunity to develop an agenda that is evidence-led, that is going to be more effective, and leave us with a criminal justice system that can turn people's lives around, not just punish them. I hope that's helpful. Very happy to take any questions you have in terms of the review recommendations.
David, so we'll come to that in a minute. I just wanted to ask, I know you've got some officials with you, and I wondered if we could get an update for the group on implementation. Like you say, you ran the review, you made recommendations, most of which have been accepted. But I know that there's a couple of officials here, and I just wondered if we could get just a quick update on the implementation, particularly in relation to the measures affecting women and women's justice. Thank you, Stephen, because I didn't want to have to say it.
I can come in and do that, Anne. So like David said on the day of publication, the Lord Chancellor set out our kind of like higher level response. So we've accepted in principle the majority of the recommendations, so bar one. So on the progression model for extended determinant sentences, but we have accepted the progression model for standard determinant sentences. I say accept in principle because Some of it will be reliant on joint working with other government departments and also need funding as well. So we'll need to see where we land in terms of spending review and the allocations process that follows. But we've accepted the broad package in principle. That includes the presumption against short sentences that you mentioned at the outset, and the LC was pretty clear in the ineffectiveness, I suppose, in short sentences, but I suppose needing it in certain cases. So we've also said with the presumption against short sentences that we'll be exempting breach of court orders effectively to stop that revolving door of presumption applies, breach a court order, and them coming back before the courts. In terms of legislation, we are working at the moment on the measures that require primary legislation. We're working at pace to do that. I can't put a specific time frame on it because we're still working that through. But hopefully it's reassuring to the group that the main thrust of this review is to help with prison capacity pressures. So we know that we need to get this on the statute book as quick as we can, so that measures can kick in and we can start helping to address those prison capacity concerns. So that is our focus at the moment, is on the primary legislative stuff. There's also a broad range of the non-legislative measures, which we're still picking up and cracking on with in parallel. But again, focuses on the primary legislative measures and making sure that we can introduce that bill as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Stephen. I just thought it'd be useful to get that as well for people. Right, so we're going to go to you for questions, reactions, comments. Maybe if we start with any clarification questions that you have for David, Stephen, or other officials, so that anyone who's thinking, I'm not quite sure what this means, and we get that out of the way so that we can all listen. So if you can put your hand up, which if you haven't been on Zoom for a while, which she kind of says for herself, I believe is in the react box now on the bottom, which has a big love heart. If you can't get your hand to go up, you can send me a love heart. I don't really mind.
There should be a raise hand icon as well at the bottom.
Yeah, mine tends to be in the react bit. That's why.
We've got one from Joy.
Joy, good morning, Joy.
Hi, David.
You can go first.
We really welcome, obviously, the presumption against under 12-month sentences, but is there any mitigation in there around the risk that women will be given longer sentences, longer than 12 months?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And in terms of coming up with our numbers, we have assumed that there'll be a certain amount of what is rather inelegantly described as up-tariffing. So there may well be cases where where sentencers say this person really does need to have a custodial sentence. We do say, by the way, that there are exceptional circumstances in which somebody might get a sentence.
David, are those defined? Will they be defined?
They're not. They are for the judiciary. We give 3 examples in terms of what could be exceptional by way of illustration. So that is breach of a court order, persistent breach of a court order. It could be reoffending whilst on a suspended sentence or released on license, or it could be in domestic abuse cases where the court determines that the victim needs a period of respite. So we use that as by way of illustrations, but those exceptional, but essentially it will be for the courts to determine what is exceptional. So there is a certain amount of flexibility there. It is also, I suppose, in the context of up tariffing, it is worth pointing out that under the progression model, for most offences, people will be released at a third of the way through their overall sentence. So if we've got somebody who's got, say, an 18-month sentence, they would be released after 6 months in normal circumstances. But yes, is there a risk, or will that happen in some cases? I think it's impossible to say that won't happen. But even so, within our numbers, we have made some, I think, reasonably cautious assumptions of the scale of that, and the consequence is still that this is going to reduce the prison population by a couple of thousand.
Thanks, David. We're going to go to Kat Arnold.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the report. Really welcome a lot of the recommendations. It's particularly interesting to hear you talk about the importance of PSR, pre-sentencing reports. At Sussex Prisons Families, we're one of the charities working on a pilot in Sussex. And I guess my question for you is, the devil will be in the detail, and how much funding the recommendations, get backed up with. So I've got to kind of ask you a question that kind of puts you on the spot a little, that, with the two recent spending reviews looking at sort of 4 to 5% across Ministry of Justice and Home Office, a lot of which are really soaked up by national insurance and inflation. If you were to sort of yourself personally pick some things that you think could start to change things overnight in reducing custodial sentences, is there anything that you would highlight? It's a bit of a on-the-spot question, but thank you.
No, not at all, and it's a very fair question, and I think we're very clear within the review that if you are moving a substantial number of people from custody into the community, you need to ensure that what happens in the community is properly funded. And indeed, if what happens in the community is not seen to work, then judges and magistrates will respond to that. And in fact, we will see much more of the up-tariffing that we were just talking about. And there will be a reluctance to make use of community sentences in the way that we think is right and proper. So we are very clear on this. We also recognise that the probation service as a whole is under a great deal of pressure already. That's without moving more people into the community. So we've got a whole set of detailed recommendations for the probation service, which I won't necessarily go into now, but one point that we do make is that the probation service needs to be properly funded. It's not just about funding, it is also about reform and using resources efficiently, but does require additional funding. And what we have seen from the spending review is in the context of relatively tight spending review, a big commitment for additional resources for probation. So that was sort of top of our list. That was the thing that we were most keen to stress. I mean, there are other aspects as well about use of approved premises, use of the voluntary sector. We really think the third sector has got a big role to play here, and is able to scale
For the
up.
mention, we all felt seen.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I'd never seen it before, David, and I have to say, I had other infrastructure organisations ringing me up and saying, your sector got a mention. I said, it is essential, and the funding is essential. And I think, the first question we had in this session was from Joy, and Joy is at Anna Wim, who are essential in providing that service in Birmingham that you saw, but they weren't funded to do so, and so that sustainability piece is really important. But we wanted to recognise the fact that we see how important we are in it. And when I've been going to the kind of kick-off engagement meetings about it, I've been trying to stop getting people to focus on probation and think about community services, because that will include supervision, offender management, and the support services. They don't have to be provided by probation.
Exactly right. And
yeah.
And we sort of use the phrase, we talk about the probation system, probation service, but we also talk about the probation system, and that's trying to capture something that is wider than just the probation service itself. So that sector, now we'll see how that is going to be implemented, and as I say, it's a very substantial uplift in terms of funding, but how that's allocated and so on, is for the MOJ to work out. But I do think that is all very important. But look, I speak as someone who cares a great deal about the use of taxpayers' money. You know, my political career was not one that was marked out about, you know, about higher spending overall. But I do think that this is potentially you know, a very good deal for the taxpayer. Is that ultimately, you know, I think a system that puts vast numbers of people in prison doesn't get good value for money if what our focus is reducing crime, and that money can be better spent in the community, and we get a much better return.
Absolutely. So we have 3 hands. So I'm going to take the 3 questions or comments, and then we'll come back to you, and then we'll try and do that again, and we should get a few rounds in. We've got Summer, then Rakaya, then Lucy. If you just go from each other, and then David can.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anne. I'm Summer Wilson-Smith. I'm a director at Advance, and we are a charity that works with women across domestic abuse and criminal justice. And as Anne said at the beginning, I think you know, how we bring this to life. And David, as you said, you know, sort of taking the recommendations as a whole and making sure that the momentum is sustained, I think is crucial. And you know, a key part of that for us is the role that domestic abuse plays in underpinning how so many women end up in prison and in the criminal justice system in the first place. And I suppose when you mentioned, David, around the training and education of justice officials, and as you referenced just now, prisons being used as a period of respite for domestic abuse survivors, much as they have been used as places of safety for mental health needs. I'd like to know or understand how you see that sort of training and education encompassing women's needs as a whole, including their experiences as victims of violence against women and girls. And realistically, how do you see that playing out with all of the funding constraints that we face, and the need to bring specialists for providers to that space and into this conversation? Sorry, big question. But I'm curious to know how you think that if there is space for that, for the DA considerations to really be made in the fullest way that they need to be.
So hi, I'm Rakaya Khan. I'm the Chief Exec at Together Women. So we're a women's provider in the north of England. So my question, so we really welcome some of the kind of ambitious proposals, particularly for women, right? But however, it feels there's like a real striking omission around. There was no mention of race, despite sort of really well evidenced disparities in sentencing, particularly for kind of racially minoritized women. So given that there's kind of lots of data, particularly from the Lammy Review and others, I just wondered why there was a real kind of omission to any particular recommendations for race, particularly kind of Black and minoritized women. And how do we ensure moving forward that those considerations are built into the recommendations that are being made?
Lucy Russell from Women in Prison. Thank you so much for listening so much to the sector, and you know, we really were celebrating when we read the review. There was so much positive in it, so really grateful for that.
Lucy, your sound isn't great.
Just 1 second.
A little bit glitchy.
There we go. Sorry, I'm just rub it into everybody. I'm sitting with a fan on. That's probably what did it.
But there you are. Now we've made you turn it off so you can be like the rest of us.
Listen, my 80s power ballad look. But yeah, thank you so much for including so many points in the review. You know, we really appreciate it. I wanted to ask a couple of points, some of which Summer has covered. But on the matter of assaults against an emergency worker, you know, thank you so much for highlighting that and for asking for further investigation. I suppose a key factor for us is that we want that to move faster and go deeper as soon as possible. And I'd be very interested to know what you see as options for what we do with that offence, because I think in the sector we're all very clear that the data, we know what the data is, and we know that it will tell us that it's disproportional to women, and in particular it's happening when women call for help with domestic abuse. One of the thoughts we had was whether the role of liaison and diversion workers was pivotal, and there could be a kind of a domestic abuse assessment at that point. Or where, but of course, very interested in that question of, or is it that actually the offence as it stands just isn't working? So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on where, perhaps, what happens after the review. And then just building on Summer's question about domestic abuse, thank you so much for putting the reference into the statutory defence. I really hope that we can see that move forward, and that's fantastic. But as Summer said, we know that domestic abuse is leading women into the criminal justice system in lots of different ways. So it's whether, forced to carry drugs, forced to shoplift, driving under duress, all those kind of factors. And we know that that isn't one offence and it isn't one particular sentence. But we're also concerned that we keep saying training, and training isn't doing anything. We're not getting anywhere. I would be really, really interested to hear your thoughts on what could this sector do, and what could we call for and shift to really get that dramatic shift, because at the moment our feeling is that we need something almost like a presumption against short sentences, that is a presumption against criminalising women for the abuse that they experience. But I'd really, really welcome your thoughts on what could be next, what happens next, what makes it get better. Thank you.
So a couple of small points there, David. Did you catch everything?
I think so, yeah. Whether I
Okay,
can answer everything is another matter, but let me try. Just on the domestic abuse book, actually, can I just pick up the point about the exceptions to not having short sentences, and the respite point. The point here, what we identified as an illustration of what could be an exception, is more that, just to be very clear, that it might be the case that the perpetrator should have a short period in custody to allow the victim to sort of sort themselves out. If you've got cohabitees, a relationship breakup, one can absolutely envisage circumstances in which the victim would benefit from a relatively short period of time in which the perpetrator, the offender, is in custody whilst the victim sorts their lives out. And that's really what we had in mind there. Just to be clear, this isn't about the essentially a reason why the victim might find themselves in prison and receiving a short custodial sentence. But look, on the wider point in terms of training, we haven't sought to be too prescriptive here as to what might happen with a view for judicial training, for example, and particularly there is a sensitivity about the independence of the judiciary, and I don't think it's for a body like ours, a review panel set up by the government to go around and tell the judiciary precisely how they train themselves. But look, the wider point here, and Anne kindly referred to the female offender strategy that was published in my time as Justice Secretary. The wider point here is for there to be an understanding of some of the complexities that can exist with female offenders who, as we know, very often are themselves victims of crime, are vulnerable, and so on. I suppose also picking up at this point Lucy's point about how do we go about doing this, what should, when it comes to statutory defences and so on. We had a lot to cover within our review in a relatively short period of time, and I make no apology for the fact that in a number of areas, when it comes to implementation, to the extent that we set out very prescriptive recommendations, that just reduces flexibility for those who are able to consider these matters in greater depth over perhaps a slightly longer time period. And I think that point applies both in terms of statutory defences and in training. I think the point we're wanting to make is further consideration needs to be given to those. And then in terms of the context of, in the context of, we were covering a lot of ground over a short period of time. To come to Rakaya's question, the whole issue of race was outside our terms of reference. This is a complex and contentious issue, and we again, in the time available, if we would, I think if we were to go into this area, you'd need to go into this area very thoroughly indeed, and ensure that you have got a strong evidence base and really work through every recommendation one was going to make in this area. And that wasn't the focus of this review. That wasn't within our terms of reference. And I understand that this is I appreciate that this is a debate that is very much a live one, provokes a lot of strong feelings and differences of opinion. So that was not an issue that we particularly focused upon. We do make recommendations about the government looking at this in greater detail in future, but it wasn't one that we felt we could do justice to in our review.
I'm just going to ask Stephen actually if he could give us an update on that, because I know the minister came to the Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Advisory Group yesterday, and again this issue was brought up about race and disproportionality, and he had some points about kind of next steps and wanting to understand more, where do we think there will be a disproportionate effect, positively and negatively, in next steps. Stephen, have you got an update for us there?
Yeah, a bit of an update, I would say. So I think during the passage of the sentencing guidelines, Act now, it got royal assent last week, the Lord Chancellor did commit to doing a review of disparities in sentencing outcomes and looking at the data on that. So I think that is something that is ongoing, but she did make that commitment on the floor of the House.
And can we get that, will that be done intersectionally? Because obviously a lot of us were lobbying on that as well in relation to women, certainly at the Women's Justice Board, we kind of felt like our hands were tied with that legislation. So will we be able to look at women from minoritized communities, particularly?
I think the scope of that review is still kind of being firmed up, so we can share the details of that once we've got a bit of a clearer idea. But yeah, I think it was looking at the disparities in the round, so we can share details on that.
And would you welcome ideas if we gathered them and sent them in?
I can check with.
With people under probation supervision. A lot of you have particular experience of working with women when there's been the probation reset and the probation, what's the other one called? Impact. Is it? Yeah. Reforms, and actually what that means for really women-centered work. What does sustainable funding look like for you? So, don't not take your time. So we've got Lisa first, and then I've got Jackie.
Thanks, Anne. I probably can come up with 3 comments in the absence of 3 hands, so you might need to tell me to shut up if I go on for too long. But thank you, David. I think everybody has sort of welcomed the review and appreciated massively your work on it. I did have just a couple of comments in relation to learnings from the review. And I suppose in relation to unintended consequences, actually, just a couple of things. Firstly, it was around your sort of noticing the impact of, or the negative impact on women in terms of the attacks on emergency workers, and just something about, again, you know, as you said, the unintended consequences, and whether there will be thoughts moving forwards about the way that equalities impact assessments are made in regards to new legislation, so that we can try and avoid some of that from the outset, as opposed to sort of, you know, finding out about it further down the line once legislation is being implemented. Another sort of thought I had in terms of unintended consequences was just really also around funding and sustainability of services, and just wanting to be really sort of clear about, you know, it's great that there are a number of initiatives, including intensive supervision corps, and I'm really, you know, sort of aware of the fantastic work that's going on in partnership with Anna Women Birmingham, which you've sort of mentioned yourself, but just want to also be sort of clear that there are, you know, lots of local areas with lots of different initiatives going on already. And I think one of the things that concerns me is that sometimes when particular initiatives are highlighted, that can actually cause confusion and repetition and undermining some of the work that's already going on in local areas, which is of high value and is also, you know, supporting women in the criminal justice system, as we do as an organisation. So just something about being mindful of, you know, when recommendations are made in terms of funding and new initiatives, to be aware of what's already happening in local areas, so there isn't a kind of, you know, undermining of current good work. And my last thought really was around liaison and diversion. I think many of us have lobbied long and hard over the years for ensuring that there isn't a postcode lottery of funding to liaison and diversion areas where there are women's pathways. Some are working fantastically well in some geographies across the country, and some areas don't have them at all. And so I think, again, just thinking about consistency of approach, it would be great to think about how we avoid the postcode lottery that we've seen specifically, I would say, in that initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Jackie, then Elizabeth.
Thanks, Anne. I just wanted to draw attention to some questions in the chat. You may have seen them, but we've got Joy, Michelle, and Rakaya have put questions, comments in the chat.
I did see them, and I was going to come back to them if we didn't have a queue. So we will get to those ones. Yeah, and don't worry, if you've asked a question already and people aren't in the queue, just hop in the queue. We'll take Elizabeth's question, then we'll go to David, and then I'll read those ones out.
Thank you, and apologies for my camera off. I'm having some issues with my internet. I'm Elizabeth. I'm here representing Hibiscus. We are an organization working with Black and minoritized migrant women in contact with the criminal and the immigration systems. I guess, as others, we welcome a number of the recommendations from the report, but we're cautious and conscious that if there is not an intersectional understanding of the barriers that different groups of women face within the criminal justice, we're going to see disparities in the implementation of those recommendations. So that's my first comment. The second one comes to we're really concerned about this blanket approach to migrant women and the recommendation of early removal, right? It was good to see this understanding of the further harm that women can encounter if they are deported from the country, and if there's not an understanding of the factors that force them into offending, right? And I guess the question to David is how we balance an approach that doesn't end up harming migrant women who are just seen as foreign nationals and end up deported without the understanding of the vulnerability and the harm that it can cause to them if they are removed from the country. How we move away from a recommendation that only focus on early removal and doesn't consider the particular vulnerabilities and the marginalization that migrant women experience, considering also the overrepresentation of Black and minoritized migrant women within the criminal justice. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So David, questions from Lisa about funding, and particularly unintended consequences, and from Elizabeth about the specific position of women who are of foreign nationality and how they don't get kind of swept up in the removal recommendation.
First of all, just to pick up the point from Lisa on unintended consequences. I mean, one of the things that we have recommended that perhaps hasn't had as much attention as it might have done is that we do recommend that there should be like an independent body that where, for example, a new offence is created or new sentences are brought in, will sort of set out the implications in terms of the sort of wider prison population and what have you, and perform a role in terms of providing independent impact assessments. And I think, you know, that would have been a useful organisation to have in place when the changes to assault on emergency workers were brought in. By the way, just to pick up, I think it was a sort of earlier point, might have been Lucy's question about assault on emergency workers. Yeah, one thing that I think the sector could do is perhaps there is a need to, you know, for clearer communication to members of Parliament that this issue is more complex than it first appears. Again, you know, I can remember the debates in my time when I was in Parliament, and it was very much look, you know, I think, you know, we all recognise the really important role that emergency workers play, and we all want to be on their side, and you know, they are entitled to be protected, but I think what got lost in all of that as to what the unintended consequences would be. So to the extent the sector is able to provide a bit of an explanation of what the real world implications have been of changes of law in this area, I think that might be quite helpful and result in a
on that, do you think there might be an opportunity to maybe at least delay the retail worker legislation? Because that one really terrifies me in terms of, you know, the training. Obviously, people working in retail will be trained by their own companies, really sporadically. You might get good partnerships happening in certain places, particularly security staff would be a concern.
I'm not close, to be honest, I'm not close enough to know where that legislation has got to and at what stage we're at. But I do think that there is a debate to be had here. And again, you know, one could see why, you know, if you are the trade union that represents shop workers, I can absolutely understand why they're campaigning for this. If you're a member of Parliament, I can understand why you would be receptive to those arguments. But there you know, there are some issues of complexity here that can get missed, and they probably do need to be heard. But yeah, sorry, coming back to Lisa's question, yes, as I say, I think that, you know, we believe an independent body would provide a very useful role in all of this. Lisa also raises questions about implementation and making sure that, you know, there is an understanding of what is done at a local level, and I think that's a good point to raise. And again, I think this comes down in terms of the sort of detailed implementation of this. But, you know, very often there are things that are done at a local level, often by voluntary organisations that are not national but local, and you want to make good use of that. But you know, I think that's a good challenge. And then in terms of Elizabeth's question in respect of foreign national offenders and the issues there, look, there's a balance that does have to be struck. I recognise that. There is a rather simplistic argument that is sometimes used. You don't need to do anything else about the prison population. You just have to deal with the 10,000 or so foreign national offenders, and there's a whole set of reasons why that is unrealistic. What we have sought to do, however, is come up with balanced recommendations that mean that if we that we do move more quickly to remove people who are not entitled to be well, are not British citizens, who have broken the law and been convicted for breaking the law in this country, and as such, there is scope, I think, for more of them to be removed earlier than is currently the case. But nor have we gone down the route that some are arguing for, that you just automatically deport everybody. But look, I think we've got the balance right. There are questions about how this is properly implemented, but we face a number of challenges with our prison population, and I think it's understandable that the public look at the numbers that we have who are foreign national offenders and question whether it is necessarily the role of the British state to be essentially dealing with all of these people, and whether some of them should return from where they've come.
Okay, I'm going to read some of the questions and comments that we've had in the chat because I haven't got any hands up, but I would also invite another round of hands up while I put these to David. So point from Joy at Anna Wim, if funding could be found for judiciary to be trained on women and what women's centres could offer, that would be very welcome. When they had funding in the old days, it was very beneficial to them. I think the importance of judiciary training is something that has really been coming up over the last few weeks in discussion with ministers and officials about implementation. Not to underestimate how important that is, particularly with things like, you don't want to, we get that you don't want to prescribe everything, but you can then get inconsistency and you can get bias. The judiciary is not diverse. The judiciary is not trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. So, sorry, for some reason, I've got the tiniest little chat screen. I'm trying to see it all. Will there be a standardised way to introduce better information in pre-sentence reports? Others have touched on the influence of trauma already, but it's great to see if risk factors we know are strongly associated with involvement in the criminal justice system could be more clearly recognised and used to inform community sentencing by magistrates, such as growing up in care, experience of abuse as a child, insecure housing. And Joy has fed back on the WERNA, which I only know in its acronym, so if somebody wants to spell that out, that would be great. Yeah, and there's a link to effective women's centres and the rollout of the WERNA. Women's risk needs assessment. Thank you for that, Joy. Much obliged. We've seen local surges where gaps in social care, SEND provision and camp support has led women being criminalised for offences such as failure to secure school attendance. In some cases after waiting years for assessments or support. How can we protect women from being prosecuted as a result of social issues and gaps in other services? So hopefully I got them all there. They were a bit folded down. Oh, and just go back up one. Alison from Lincolnshire Action Trust. There is a risk that the potential for liaison and diversion to be better adapted for women and girls will be lost in the transfer of L&D commissioning from NHS England to ICBs and the silence on what is happening with L&D after March 26th, when many existing contracts will end. It'd be useful to know what safeguards will be put in place to prevent this opportunity being lost, given funding is not directly from MOJ. Now, David, I'm not saying that you don't know this stuff, you're a clever man, but if you don't have these answers, we will get these answers for people from relevant places.
No, thank you, Anne. And look, I think a lot of these, are really valuable points, but it does come down to now, in many respects, the detail of the implementation, and I think for some of those it is, for the reasons that I have set out, that we had a lot of ground to cover in a relatively short period of time, and also a sense that some of the sort of very specific implementation questions there are people better placed, even than the distinguished panel I had the privilege of serving with. There are people better placed within the system to develop that, including very often in departments other than the MOJ, and a few of these questions do relate to that and about joined up government, etc., etc. So it's hard for me to go much beyond that for most of these questions, but I think these have raised a number of important points.
I would like to ask you if you know anything about this one, because you made a particular recommendation about long-term sustainable funding for women's centres. Do you know anything about that funding? Obviously, because it's been accepted as a recommendation. We're all delighted. Will it be ring-fenced multi-year? Might it again be at risk of short-term commissioning cycles?
I think on that we wait to see. There are additional resources to go into the community, which has been announced. I suspect that hasn't yet been determined within the MOJ exactly how that is going to operate. I don't know the answer to that. They have a budget. They're going to have to make some decisions. We obviously have the spending review on the 11th of June, and that gives you the sort of top line figures. From my experience in government, I would imagine that they are still working out precisely beyond the top line numbers that we have how that's going to be allocated.
I'm going to ask a question from Jessica Douglas in the chat, then I'm going to go to Kirsty and Lisa on the next round. So Jessica asks, is there going to be consideration for residential treatment for women, including pregnant women and those with children who have substance use needs? Come on, screen. It's frozen. Oh, you had one job, Fox. As an alternative to custody, part of community sentencing. So could we have people going to recovery houses, diversion to treatment? I
mean, what we recommend in the review is greater use of alternatives to custody here, and so whether some of that could be a residential service for women with substance use needs. I don't think we make specific reference to that, but look, what is the broad principle here that we're arguing is that things can be done more effectively and more cost effectively in the community, and I think it's a question of establishing which services are most effective, and greater use of those should follow.
I go to the other hands just to say, Jessica, I am the co-sponsor of the work stream on pregnant women and women with dependent children on the Women's Justice Board with Dr. Shona Minson, partly I think because for a good number of years ago, I was the head of public policy at the National Childbirth Trust, which is how I know Kirsty, who's coming next. But Jessica, if you want to send me anything you have on kind of the evidence and the examples, that's the kind of stuff that we'll be hoping to engage a bit wider once we know what the kind of strategic priorities they want us to look at initially. But that's the kind of things, what are the alternatives? What should we be doing? But the Women's Justice Board does want to take a specifically different approach for pregnant women and women with, we got to change from young to dependent children, because young children doesn't really exist in policy and legislation, whereas dependent does. And I know there's some issues about children that are not in your custody, but we will work out that stuff as we come along. So I'm going to go to Kirsty, Lisa and Rachel, and then back to David, and that might bring us to the end. So keep it succinct if we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, David. I'm Kirsty Kitchen. I'm head of policy at the charity Birth Companions. So we have a focus on pregnant women and mothers of young children in the criminal justice system. We were very grateful for the specific references that were made throughout the review on the ways in which mechanisms that have a more sort of general reach can particularly benefit pregnant women and mothers of young children because of the very specific needs associated there. My question is potentially a little bit cheeky. It's not intentionally cheeky, but I think given the sort of degree of experience you have, David, of being in government and leading what was a very, significant piece of work around criminal justice reform for women, from within your party, I'm very conscious that we as a sector need to be ready to support the movement of these recommendations and proposals through Parliament, and that we need to be ready to argue the case for this alongside those who are in power now, to make sure that this does turn into real tangible change, and doesn't get derailed politically. And we know the extent of political interference often with sentencing policy and criminal justice policy more generally. So just be keen to hear any thoughts you have on the sort of your anticipation for how other sides of the House might respond to this, have responded already to these proposals, and how we support their movement through into real legislation. Thank you.
So then, Rachel, please.
Hi, sorry, it's just struggling with mute. It's really just on the back of Jess's question. So I'm the head of operations for Phoenix Futures for Women and Families. So within them services, we've got Sheffield Family Service, which is a specific residential rehab for women and families with their children under 10 years old. And Ophelia House is a trauma responsive residential rehab for women only in Oxfordshire. We are doing a lot of work around improving pathways between prison and rehab, because it's definitely something that is kind of high on our agenda. It's something that we are kind of doing. We've got actually a lady coming in the next few weeks directly from prison with to hopefully come in and have her baby in Sheffield Families. But I think that if there's anything specifically, Anne, from what you were saying that we can be involved in, that would be amazing. I think that we have got really good services that can kind of support and input with that residential services as an alternative to custody. And we've also started doing some work on return on social investment, that, doing this is really, really cost effective alternative to both custody and ongoing kind of effects on statutory services within the community. So basically anything we can be involved in, that would be amazing.
I'm going to be in touch with you, Rachel, for a visit, okay?
Yes, and definitely come and see the services. We would really welcome anybody to come and have visits to the services, because I think that, Sheffield Families is the only service of its kind now. Ophelia House is, again, one of very few services that are women's only trauma-informed services for residential rehab. So as much promotion and kind of networking and building relationships we can do is really, really welcomed.
And what I would say to you all in terms of working on the implementation of this kind of stuff is your models, where you have them. I know a lot of this stuff, like obviously there was the publication just before the review of the work around the economic model of women's centres by the National Women's Justice Coalition. That kind of stuff is incredibly welcome. Well, how does your model work? What does it cost? What are the outcomes? Any of that stuff you have, start to compile it. Make sure that we have it, because we get asked for it as well. And we have a specific role as well as working like across the women's collectives and women's specific organisations. Lisa.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks for the sort of highlighting of the National Women's Justice Coalition report, in partnership with the Women's Budget Group, about the cost effectiveness of women's centres. I think that was a key document which has really helped. I think everybody understand the value of the work that we as women's centres do. My question was a quick one, and it may well be for the officials on the call rather than for David, so sorry about that, David, but I was just interested to know if there's any thinking going on currently in terms of the recommendation around the sustained funding of women's centres, just off the back of that conversation, whether there was some thinking happening around joining up the funding streams. Obviously, we all know that we're sort of rapidly heading towards the recommissioning for the next generation of community rehabilitation services and women's services that will be, you know, recommissioned in that space in the next sort of 12 months, 18 months. I guess my hope is that there will be some thinking about how we can really consolidate and join up all of these investments and not sort of, you know, it ending up in a situation where we're being asked to sort of apply for different pots of money in, you know, over a sort of period of time that just puts additional pressure on us as small to medium charities who are trying to, you know, make sure that the money, public money, I know that's important to you, David, is going where it needs to go, which is to support the women that we work with. So anything that involves, you know, conversation around how we can consolidate future investment of funds into the sector would be very welcome.
Great. Well, thank you for those questions and comments. And Lisa, I think you're probably right. There's not much more I can say in terms of that question. And you know, Rachel, thank you for what you were saying in terms of the work that you're doing and how important that is, and that all sounds, you know, terrific. And you know, I certainly hope, and you know, this is, I think, I hope comes across in our review. You know, that willingness to try to find alternatives to custody wherever possible, and you know, scope for innovation and development and so on is really important, and that's something that I think the voluntary sector can do incredibly well. Coming to Kirsty's question in terms of what the parliamentary response is going to be, particularly from the opposition parties, not a cheeky question at all, I would say, but look, I think it'd be fair to say the initial response from the Conservatives has not been particularly warm or welcoming. I know that there are a lot of Conservative MPs who are, you know, who do have some sympathy, I think, for what we're trying to do, who recognise that this was a problem that predates this government in terms of the capacity crisis, and you know, want to be led by the evidence. At the moment, the response is more about, you know, this is going to create an enormous crime wave, and if you release people, then you know, there'll be a loss of control, that the incarceration rate is really, you know, is incarceration is an effective way of reducing crime, that deterrence is very important, etc., etc. So that is not particularly you know, supportive of this agenda. It's not necessarily shared, as I say, by every Conservative MP. I think Reform, we're obviously, you know, doing very well in the opinion polls, likely to take a similar route. To be honest, I've not noticed them saying very much about this at all so far, but you know, but they are likely to take a kind of prison works approach. The Liberal Democrats, and you know, we shouldn't forget the Liberal Democrats are, you know, got 72 seats. They're, you know, a very strong third party in this parliament, have been broadly supportive. There are some areas which they will sort of raise questions and so on, but are pretty broadly supportive of this agenda, and so have, yeah, as I say, been taken what I would describe as a more
And their spokesperson is previously of this parish, as they say. So Josh Barberinde was the founder of Crackdebt, a social enterprise working with people in the criminal justice system.
And they've been first met him at the MOJ when he was
fixing phones.
Fixing phones, yes. So
yeah. But obviously has been really strong as well about domestic abuse as a crime, and what happens to women who commit crimes in the context of domestic abuse. So I think they could be quite an important angle.
Indeed. So I think that, look, I think that's that's a broad overview of kind of where the parliamentary position is. I'm not expecting this to have cross-party support. What my hope is, I have to say, in terms of, because I think Kirsty's question is a good one about what's going to be sustained over a period of time. What I hope can happen is that we will, that this agenda is pursued, and it's still some years until the next general election, and we can start to see, by the time we get to say 2029, we can start to see the benefits, that the evidence is starting to emerge. This does not result in a huge crime wave, but in fact quite the opposite, that we make progress in terms of reducing reoffending rates. And I think there is an opportunity over the next few years to build a new consensus. But what tends to build a consensus is the evident success of a policy that a government brings in. And what I hope can happen, that we can move quickly. And as I say, by the time we get to the end of this parliament, this is a much less contentious area, as the evidence shows that using alternatives to custody, to having a successful, properly funded operation in the community, consisting of both the probation service and a strong voluntary sector, that is a model that is popular and sustainable, provides good value for money for the taxpayer, and turns people's lives around. And I'd say certainly my view is what the government needs to do is kind of crack on and deliver that agenda, and then articulate the case for it.
I would absolutely agree. I think my advice to those of you in this sector is know who your MP is. This legislation is going to have to go through a pace. It might be a little bit messy. Get something together. Make sure that they understand that you're there. I know, prime example, I was at Alana House a few weeks ago with Minister Dakin and the local MP, and they know him really well. He's government party, it'll be a government bill. But you could get some backbenchers who are concerned, particularly people, I think, with links to policing, and we're concerned about that, crime wave side of things. And yeah, for those of you as well who've been talking about residential rehab and the importance of gender-specific services, I think with all of that, all of the alternative models, you need to be really, now trying to position them in the context of where do they sit in the review. So if you have a service or a model, look at which recommendations does this deliver on, where in the bill when the bill comes out. So alternatives to custody now being very firmly on the agenda here in the plan. But I'm going to thank you all for your time. David, did you have any final remarks?
Yeah, if I may, I just want to build on your excellent comment there. Look, we've got a series of organisations here from across the country. The legislation is likely to come forward, before the Parliament breaks up in July, and then it'll be taken through in the autumn. Do invite your local MPs in. Do show what you are doing. I'm sure most of them will be fascinated by it and keen to engage. And if I can ask a favour, you've all been very kind about the review, but if I can ask a favour, is to kind of go and explain to your members of Parliament why there are many positive things about this review, why it will make a positive difference. And it doesn't matter which party they're from and what have you. Do engage with that, because that is a way in which we can shift public opinion here. The MPs who are engaged in this debate are by and large ones who are, who reach very similar conclusions, I think, to what all of us are reaching. So the more we can get MPs engaged with this, I think the more likely we'll build a strong consensus for it.
I couldn't agree more. And I also think that I know the context is the prison crisis, but actually when you frame this in relation to women, I actually think that it sounds a bit panicked, well, the prisons are full, we need to do something. There is very strong evidence that you need a different approach to women because the approach we have does not work. It causes more harm, it causes reoffending. So I think that thing about, contextualizing this to say in relation to women, which, you as organizations are in the main women specific, so you're able to have that focus to talk about, this is what we know, this is what the evidence suggests, and this is how it will work. So it just remains, David, for me to thank you, to thank your panel on our behalf. I know we met with some of them kind of in the course of the work, and to the officials and to members of the Women's Network, myself and Nicola Drinkwater, who's on the Partnership Delivery Group. We will be coming back from a Women's Justice Board point of view every quarter at least. Very happy to engage more frequently when we know more, but we will be linking, Clinks will be linking in, as we always do, around these reforms with all of our priorities, of which one is women, and that's why we have the brilliant Jackie. David, everybody, thank you for your time. I wish you all a lovely rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.